1861, the new European IMS, realism, positivism, Marxism. The revolutions of 1848 failed not only in Germany but also in Hungary, Italy, and France. The springtime of peoples, as it was called, was followed by chilling blasts of winter. The dreams of half a century, visions of a humane nationalism, aspirations for liberalism without violence, ideals of a peaceful and democratic republican commonwealth were all exploded. Everywhere the cry had been for constitutional government, but only in a few smaller states, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, Piedmont, was constitutional liberty more firmly secured by the revolutions of 1848. Everywhere the cry had been for the freedom of nations, to unify national groups or rid them of foreign rule. But nowhere was national liberty more advanced in 1850 than it had been 2 years before. France established universal male suffrage in 1848 and kept it permanently thereafter, except for a brief reversion to a restricted suffrage in 1850 to 1851, but it did not establish a democracy. It settled into a kind of popular dictatorship under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. One accomplishment, however, was real enough. The peasantry was emancipated in the German states and the Austrian Empire. Serfdom and manorial restraints were abolished, nor were they reimposed after the failure of the revolutions. This was the most fundamental accomplishment of the whole movement. The peasant masses of Central Europe were thereafter free to move about, find new jobs, enter a labor market, take part in a money economy, receive and spend wages, migrate to growing cities, or even go to the United States. But the peasants, once freed, 959 showed little concern for constitutional or liberal ideas. Peasant emancipation, in fact, strengthened the forces of political counter-revolution. New freedoms for peasants. The most immediate and far-reaching consequence of the 1848 revolutions, or of their failure, was a new kind of intellectual and political realism. Idealism and romanticism were discredited in European culture and politics. Revolutionaries became less optimistic, conservatives more willing to exercise repression. It was now a point of pride to be realistic, emancipated from illusions, willing to face facts as they were. The future, it was thought, would be determined by present realities rather than by imagining what ought to be. Industrialization went forward, with England still far in the lead, but now spreading across the continent and initiating the momentous transformation of Germany. The 1850s were a period of rising prices and wages, thanks in part to the gold rush in California. There was more prosperity than in the 1840s. The propertied classes felt more secure, and labor leaders often turned from broad theories of society to the organizing of viable unions, especially in the skilled trades. Materialism, realism, positivism. The mid-19th century intellectual themes appeared in a new philosophical emphasis on materialism, holding that everything mental, spiritual, or ideal was an outgrowth of physical or physiological forces. In literature and the arts, the new themes contributed to descriptions or portrayals of the social world that came to be called realism. Writers and painters broke away from romanticism, which they said colored things out of all relation to the real facts. The realists attempted to represent and reproduce life as they found it, without intimation of a better or nobler world. The French writer Gustave Flaubert, for example, wrote meticulous descriptions of a provincial woman's tedious, unhappy marriage in his famous novel Madame Bovary, 1857, a book that both 961 mocked the illusions of romantic literature and showed the new artistic desire for a precise, unsentimental literary language. More people in this era came to trust science, not merely for an understanding of nature, but for insights into the true meaning of human life and social relations. In religion, the movement was toward skepticism, renewing skeptical trends of the 18th century, which had been somewhat interrupted during the intervening period of Romanticism. It was variously held, not by all, but by many intellectuals and other persons in the urban professional classes, that religion was unscientific and hence 534 not to be taken seriously, or that it was a mere historical growth among peoples in certain stages of development and hence irrelevant to modern civilization, or that one ought to go to church and lead a decent life without taking the priest or clergyman too seriously, because religion was necessary to preserve the social order against radicalism and anarchy. To this idea, the radical or working class counterpart was the claim that religion was a bourgeois invention to delude the people. Positivism was another term used to describe the new attitude. It originated with the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who had begun to publish his numerous volumes on positive philosophy as long ago as 1830 and was still writing in the 1850s. He saw human history as a series of three stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and the scientific. The French revolutions of 1789 and 1848 suffered, in his view, from an excess of metaphysical abstractions, empty words, and unverifiable high-flying principles. According to Comte, those who worked for the improvement of society must adopt a strictly scientific outlook, and he set out to promote this outlook by producing an elaborate classification of the sciences, of which the highest would be the science of society, for which he coined the word sociology. This new science would build upon the systematic observation of actual positive facts to develop broad scientific laws of social progress. Comte himself and his closest disciples envisaged a final scientific religion of humanity, which, stripped of archaic theological and metaphysical concerns, would serve as the basis for a better world in the future. More generally, however, positivism came to mean an insistence on verifiable facts, an avoidance of wishful 962 thinking, a questioning of all assumptions, and a dislike of unprovable generalizations. Positivism, in a broad sense, both in its demand for observation of facts and testing of ideas, and in its aspiration to be humanly useful, contributed to the growth of the social sciences as a branch of learning and as an intellectual foundation for the expanding belief in historical progress. Auguste Comte. In politics, the new emphasis on realism came to be known by the German term Realpolitik. This simply meant a politics of reality. In domestic affairs, it meant that people should give up utopian dreams, such as had caused the revolutionary debacle of 1848, and content themselves with the blessings of an orderly, honest, hard-working government. For radicals, it meant that people should stop imagining that the new society would result from goodness or the love of justice, and that social reformers must resort to the strategic methods of politics, power, and calculation. In international affairs, realpolitik meant that governments should not be guided by ideology or by any system of natural enemies or natural allies, or by any desire to defend or promote any particular view of the world, but that they should follow their own practical or strategic interests, meet facts and actual situations as they arose, make any alliances that seemed useful, disregard ethical theories and scruples, and use any practical means to achieve their ends. The same persons who before 1848 had been not ashamed to express pacifist and cosmopolitan hopes now dismissed such ideas as a little soft-headed. War, which governments had successfully tried to prevent since the final overthrow of Napoleon in 1815, was accepted in the 1850s as a strategic option that was sometimes needed to achieve a political purpose. It was not especially glorious. It was not an end in itself. It was simply one of the tools of realistic statesmanship. Realpolitik was by no means confined to Germany or even to the leaders of European governments, despite its German name and despite the fact that the famous German Chancellor Bismarck became its most famous 963535 practitioner. Two other realpolitik thinkers, each in his own way, were Karl Marx and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Realpolitik, early Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were among the disappointed revolutionaries of 1848. Marx, 1818 to 1883, was the son of a lawyer in the Prussian Rhineland. He studied law and philosophy at several German universities and received a doctoral degree in 1841. Unable to find an academic job, Marx associated with radical German intellectuals, began writing for left-wing journals, and soon moved to Paris with other Germans who wanted to produce philosophical publications in the historic birthplace of modern revolutions. Engels, 1820 to 1893, the son of a well-to-do German textile manufacturer, was sent as a young man to Manchester in England, where his father owned a factory, to learn the business and then manage it. Marx and Engels met in Paris in 1844. The French government forced Marx to leave Paris early in the following year, but Marx and Engels would continue a close intellectual and political collaboration over the next 40 years, mostly in England. In 1847, they joined the Communist League, a tiny secret group of revolutionaries, mainly Germans in exile in the more liberal cities of Western Europe. The word communist then had only a vague meaning, and the League, as Engels later recalled, was at first not actually much more than the German branch of the French secret societies. It agitated like other societies during the revolutions of 1848 and issued a set of demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which urged a unified, indivisible German republic, democratic suffrage, universal free thought education, arming of the people, a progressive income tax, limitations upon inheritance, state ownership of banks, railroads, canals, mines, and the like, and a degree of large-scale scientific collectivized agriculture. 964 was such obscurely voiced radicalism that alarmed the Frankfurt Assembly. With the triumph of counter-revolution in Germany, the Communist League was crushed. The Communist League. It was for this league that Marx and Engels wrote their Communist Manifesto, which was published in January 1848. But there was as yet no Marxism, and Marxism played no role in the revolutions of 1848. It would not really emerge as a historical force in European societies until the 1870s. Meanwhile, with the failure of the revolutions, Engels returned to his factory at Manchester. Marx also settled in England, spending the rest of his life in London, where after long labors in the library of the British Museum, he finally produced his huge work called Capital, of which the first volume was published in German in 1867. The final 2 volumes were edited by Engels and published after Marx's death. Sources and content of Marxism. Marxism may be said to have had 3 sources, or to have merged 3 national streams of early 19th century European history: German philosophy, French revolutionism, and the British Industrial Revolution. As a student in Germany, and for a while thereafter, Marx mingled with a group known as Young Hegelians, who were actually critics of Hegel in that they expected the course of history to lead to a free and democratic society, instead of to the existing Prussian state as Hegel had maintained. Like Democrats and Republicans in other countries, they believed that the promise of the French Revolution had not yet been fulfilled, because social and economic equality, as well as a true political equality, should follow the civil and legal equality already won. In keeping with the general movement of 536 Romanticism, the young, or left Hegelians hoped for a more personal emancipation from the trammels of society, government, and religion. In the mid-1840s, elaborating on Hegel, Marx developed the idea of the alienation of labor, a social experience and state of mind produced when human beings in the historic process of mechanization become estranged from the objects on which they work. This alienation, as Marx described it, was a distinctive feature of modern capitalist societies. The economic system of wage labor and private ownership of the means of production kept workers from identifying with or benefiting from the products of their labor. In fact, Marx argued the wealth, or capital, that workers produced was regularly used against them in the social and political institutions of capitalist societies. It followed that true freedom would become possible only when private production of industrial goods was abolished. Some of the early writings in which these ideas were worked out in the 1840s were not published until a century later. They then led to a wide-ranging reconsideration of Marxism, in which the early Marx was seen more as a social analyst, left, Hegelian philosopher, or 966 critical historian than as a revolutionary. But Marx's early writings had little impact on the growth of Marxism as a program for revolutionary socialism in the 19th century. Engels and British industrialism. Engels, engaged in the Manchester cotton industry, possessed a personal knowledge of the new industrial and factory system in England. In 1844, he published a revealing book, The Condition of the Working Classes in England. He drew from his observations much the same conclusions that Marx drew from philosophical analysis and historical 537 study. The depressed condition of labor was an actual fact. It was a fact that labor received a relatively small portion of the national income, and that much of the product of society was being reinvested in stocks and industrial technologies, which belonged as private property to private persons. Government and parliamentary institutions, also as a matter of fact, were in the hands of the well-to-do in both Great Britain and France. Religion was commonly viewed as necessary for keeping the lower classes in order, but such views did not encourage the kinds of reform movements that religious groups had often led in other centuries and in other cultures. The churches at the time actually took little interest in problems of the workers. The family, as an institution, was indeed disintegrating among laboring people in the cities through exploitation of women and children and the overcrowding in inadequate and unsanitary living quarters. Much of this was seized upon and dramatized in the Communist Manifesto as a summons to revolution. The outbreak of revolution in France in February 1848 and its rapid spread to other countries confirmed Marx and Engels in their beliefs. They interpreted the actual class war that shook Paris in the June days as a manifestation of a universal class struggle, in which the workers or proletariat would rise against the owners of capital, the bourgeoisie. The Communist Manifesto. As a call to action, the Communist Manifesto was meant to be inflammatory. It went beyond facts to denunciation and exhortation. It said that workers were deprived of the wealth they had themselves 968 created. It called the state a committee of the bourgeoisie for the exploitation of the people. Religion was a drug to keep the worker quietly dreaming upon imaginary heavenly 538 rewards. The women and children in working-class families had been brutalized by the bourgeoisie, and many women were forced into prostitution. It seemed to Marx and Engels that uprooted workers should be loyal to nothing, except their own class. Even the workers' native country, in their view, had become meaningless. The proletarian had no country. Workers everywhere had the same problems and faced everywhere the same enemy. Therefore, let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So closed the manifesto. But Marx was more interested in revolutionary theory than daily political activity. His mature thought was a system for producing revolution. But it showed how revolution would necessarily come by operation of vast historical forces. It was from English sources that Marx developed much of his economic theory, as expounded at length in Capital. From British political economy and the influential Manchester School of economic writers, he adopted the subsistence theory of wages, or iron law, which most economists soon abandoned because wages did in fact begin to rise. This theory held that the average worker could never obtain more than a minimum living standard, of which the corollary, for those who wished to draw it, was that the existing economic system held out no better future for the laboring class as a class. Marx likewise took from British economists the labor theory of value, holding that the value of any human-made object depended ultimately on the amount of labor put into it, capital being regarded as the stored-up labor of former times. Most economists, it must be said, soon discarded the theory that economic value is produced by the input of labor alone. Marx drew upon the labor theory, however, to develop his doctrine of surplus value, which, to simplify, meant in effect that workers were being robbed because they received in wages only a fraction of the value of the products that their 969 labor produced. This difference, or surplus value, was expropriated by the capitalist owners of the factories. Workers in this system, as Marx described them, would never receive wages that were equivalent to what they produced, which meant that capitalism was constantly menaced by the overproduction of goods that people could not afford to buy. Capitalist economies thus faced recurring crises and depressions that forced the factory owners to search constantly for new and growing markets. But the structural causes of these crises did not disappear. It was the Depression of 1847, according to Marx, that had precipitated the revolutions of 1848. And with every such depression during the rest of his lifetime, Marx hoped that the day of the Great Social Revolution was drawing nearer. British political economy. What brought all these economic observations together in a unified doctrine was the philosophy of dialectical materialism. By dialectic, Marx meant what the German philosopher Hegel had meant, that all things are in movement and in evolution, and that all change comes through the clash of antagonistic forces and ideas. The implications of the dialectic for both Hegel and Marx were that all history is a process of development in which events unfold in a clear historical direction, that every event happens for good and sufficient reasons, and that history, though not exactly predetermined, is always shaped by impersonal forces and deep structural changes, rather than by individuals or chance events. Dialectical materialism. Marx differed from Hegel in one vital respect. Whereas Hegel emphasized the primacy of ideas in social change, Marx gave emphasis to the primacy of material conditions, or the relations of production, which included technology, inventions, natural resources, and property systems. These material realities create the social world in which people live. It is 970th the relations of production that determine the most widely accepted or dominant religions, philosophies, governments, laws, and moral values in specific 539 societies. To believe that ideas cause the changes in social and political history was, in Marx's view, Hegel's most significant error. Hegel had thought, for example, that the mind conceives the idea of freedom, which it then realizes in the Greek city-state, in Christianity, in the French Revolution, and in the Kingdom of Prussia. Not at all, according to Marx. The idea of freedom, or any other idea, was generated by specific economic and social conditions. Conditions were the roots, ideas, the trees. Hegel had held the ideas to be the roots and the resulting actual conditions to be the trees. Or, as Marx and Engels said, they found Hegel standing on his head and set him on his feet again. Historical development. In the picture of historical development offered by Marx, material conditions, or the relations of production, give rise to economic classes. Agrarian conditions produce a landholding or feudal class, but with changes in trade routes, money, and productive techniques, a new commercial or bourgeois class arises. Each class, feudal and bourgeois, develops an ideology suited to its economic and political needs. The two classes inevitably clash. Bourgeois revolutions against feudal interests break out when bourgeois economic development becomes increasingly constrained by the political power of the older feudal or aristocratic class, as in England in 1642, in France in 1789, in Germany in 1848, though the bourgeois revolution in Germany proved abortive. Meanwhile, as the bourgeois class develops, it inevitably calls another class into being, its dialectical antithesis, the proletariat. The bourgeois is defined as the private owner of capital, the proletarian as the wage worker who possesses nothing but his or her own hands. The more a country becomes industrialized and bourgeois, the more it also develops a proletarian laboring class. Under competitive conditions, the bourgeois 971 tend to devour and absorb each other. Ownership of the factories, mines, machines, and railroads, capital, becomes concentrated into very few hands. Others sink into the proletariat. In the end, the proletarianized mass simply takes over from the remaining bourgeois. It expropriates the expropriators, and a social revolution abolishes private property as the ownership system for the means of production. Marx assumed that this revolution would create a classless society, because social classes arose from economic differences that would disappear. The state and religion, being outgrowths of bourgeois interests, would also disappear. For a time, until all vestiges of bourgeois interests had been rooted out, or until the danger of counter-revolution against socialism had been overcome, there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat. After that, the state would wither away, because there would no longer be an exploiting class that required it. Class war between bourgeois and proletariat. In the meantime, bourgeois and proletarian were locked in a universal struggle. Marx wanted workers always to recognize that the employer was their class enemy, and that government, law, morality, and religion were merely so much artillery directed against them. Workers must never let themselves be fooled. They must learn how to detect the class interest underlying the most exalted institutions and beliefs. But they would be helped by intellectuals who could explain the strategies of their economic enemies. Given this enduring class struggle, Marx argued that it would be dangerous for labor unions merely to obtain better wages or hours by negotiation with employers, for by such little gains the war itself might be forgotten. It would likewise be dangerous and even treasonous for workers to put faith in democratic machinery or social legislation, for the state's laws would continue to express the will of the stronger class. Right and justice were thin emanations of class interest. We must hold, wrote Marx in 1875, to the realistic outlook 549-972, which has cost so much effort to instill into the party, but which has now taken root in it. And it was by such claims to realism or a realistic outlook that Marx sought to separate communism from earlier socialist theories. Marx's many critics have long argued, however, that his own theories, though claiming a new realism, actually proposed inadequate or unrealistic accounts of human history, as well as the future development of industrial societies. The significance of Marxism, its strength and weaknesses. The original Marxism was a hard doctrine, with both advantages and handicaps in the winning of adherents. One of its advantages was its claim to be scientific. Marx classified earlier and rival forms of socialism as utopian. They rested on moral indignation, and their formula for 973 reforming society was for human beings to become more just, or for the upper classes to enact reforms as they became more responsive or sympathetic to the needs of the lower classes. His own doctrine, Marx insisted, had nothing to do with ethical ideas. It was purely scientific, resting upon the study of actual facts and real processes. And it showed that socialism would be a historical continuation rather than a miraculous reversal of what was already taking place. He also considered it utopian and unscientific to describe the future socialist society in any detail. It would be classless, with neither bourgeois nor proletarian, but to lay any specific plans would be idle dreaming. Marxism thus brought together ideas that were scientific, historical, philosophical, political, and apocalyptic. The upper classes feared and condemned Marxist ideas throughout Europe, but some elements of Marxism also reduced its attraction among the lower 541 classes. The working people of Europe were not really in the frame of mind of an army in battle. They hesitated to subordinate all else to the distant prospect of a class revolution. They were not exclusively class people, nor did they behave as such. They still held to religious beliefs or to a political faith in natural rights that could not portray morality as simply a class weapon or right and justice as bourgeois deceptions. Increasingly, they had national loyalties to their own countries, and they were not inclined to identify emotionally with a world proletariat in an unrelenting struggle against their own neighbors. Conflicting working-class values. The cure for the revolutionism of 1848 proved in time to be the admission of the laboring classes to a fuller membership in economic and political institutions. Wages generally rose after 1850, labor unions were organized, and by 1870 in the principal European countries, the working man very generally had gained the right to vote. Through their unions, workers were often able to get better wages and working conditions by direct pressure upon employers. Having the vote, they 974 gradually formed working-class parties and sought to advance their interests through the state. Marx's dismissive term for these maneuvers was opportunism, but such political campaigns gained increasing support among workers, most of whom wanted to better themselves by dealing with employers and by obtaining social reforms through existing government institutions rather than by waging class war. From Marxism, the European working class absorbed much, including a watchful hostility to employers and a sense of working class solidarity. But on the whole, as Marxism spread at the close of the 19th century, it ceased to be really revolutionary. Had the old Europe not gone to pieces in the 20th century wars, and had Marxism not been revived by Lenin and transplanted to Russia, it is probable that Marx's ideas would have been gradually domesticated into the general body of European thought, and that much less would have been said about them in later years in Europe or elsewhere. Opportunism.